First of all, by the way, the 2023 counteroffensive that was marketing genius, and they had commercials for "Shh, coming" and all this other crap. It's like a bad movie where the protagonist goes, "I'm going to take my right leg and I'm going to put it into your left ear." Yeah, nowhere in human history, I think, is a general gone, "Hey, make sure they know exactly what time and where we're going to be there." Because we don't want them to be surprised. We're just gonna. This hasn't happened since armies lined up in rows on a battlefield, looked at each other, and said, "Okay, let's get it on." You know, the whole point is you don't want to tell the guy where to build up because this is where we're gonna be there. But they did it, and when they got sent in, they and there's a tendency on the Russian side. Oh, NATO tactics don't work well, and I've corrected them. Like, look, these aren't NATO tactics. These are basic guidelines on breaching defensive structures anywhere. The Russian army uses them too because this is what everybody's learned is the best way. But the problem with the Ukrainians were to complete what they needed to do. They needed to have at least air parity, if not air dominance, at least enough anti-aircraft systems to keep an enemy aviation at bay, a hell of a lot more engineering assets, and tube superiority for artillery tube and artillery rocket superiority. That way you could depress and suppress the enemy artillery and the enemy firing positions while you're trying to cut through their obstacle course that they've set up for you. Ukraine had none of those. So basically, they just got a lot of armored vehicles. They got a lot of strategy missing them, or a lot of tactics missing the very key points, and they got sent in to die. And 85,000 dead to take 120 square kilometers, which to somebody may sound like a small piece, but that's realistically 12 kilometers wide, 10 kilometers deep. That's kind of World War One casualty rates for pieces of land like that. I mean, that's a tiny, tiny piece of land to lose 85,000 dead and I don't know how many wounded. You figure out about twice as many wounded. So from that point, what will the Europeans do? We're already fighting NATO. We're unofficially fighting NATO. When the Poles take 10,000 casualties, that's not because they're mercenaries. I mean, they're sheep dipped as mercenaries, but that's entire battalions that go over all of a sudden as mercenaries and then come back and start serving again. That's rotations to get people combat proficient. But they take casualties. That's part of being combat proficient. Take casualties, you get shot at. The Finns are doing that. When suddenly 2,000 Finns quit the Finnish army, it ain't that big to begin with. We have 2,000 guys suddenly quit. And you've seen this in different European countries. But I mean, look, a lance corporal from a parachute regiment, dead from the English army. Do you think he's the only one there? Yeah, that doesn't work that way. He's not a deserter. He's not an instructor. So what the hell is he? He's a line trooper. Well, if there's a lance corporal, there's a sergeant, and there's a bunch of privates and probably a few officers. There may be a whole battalion sitting there fighting, at least a company level element. So yes, we're fighting NATO as it is. We're already in combat with NATO. NATO just hasn't put NATO flags up. Macron, this is one of the problems with Macron. Macron is going to have to explain hundreds of dead Frenchmen. Whether they're French legionnaires, which is, but they're Russian, Ukrainian, French legionnaires. Yeah, but they're still part of the French army. They're not a mercenary force. They're an official portion, part of the French army, probably the best part of the French army. How do you explain? And it's popped up several times in French politics, and it's been hushed down. It hasn't exactly blown up yet, but it's going to blow up sooner or later. But if you get the French army in, that's taking lots of casualties, you can kind of take the rest of those casualties and put them under the rug of all the other casualties and hide your nefarious plans to send Frenchmen off to die that have been in effect for the last 4 years. I mean, you see generals that, French general, 70-some years old, goes off into the mountains for a walk and falls down a gorge. Lots of car crashes of NATO officers, plane crashes, helicopter crashes. All of a sudden, this whole splurge of people just mysteriously dying, an American Marine colonel dying in his bed all of a sudden after supposedly going somewhere. They suddenly find his body dead. You start looking at this, and it just doesn't add up because if it's either consistently happens every year, but no, it's just happening now. It hadn't, 50 years for it didn't happen, but it's happening now. You understand these guys are being killed on the battlefield. I've talked to people from Fort Bragg or serving right now. They talk, yeah, we all know guys are over there getting killed. Families are being paid off to shut up when they're being killed, and we know that. So it's one of those open secrets. So unfortunately, I think we're already there, just at least to some degree.
Yeah. Well, just on this, I think one of the miscalculation of the 2023 counteroffensive was that to some extent perhaps NATO fell for its own propaganda, because in attrition warfare, where territory isn't the most important thing, but again, exhausting the adversary, it looked as if Russia took the decision to tighten up this long, weakly defended supply line. So pulling back from Kharkov and Kherson, creating this very tightly, well defended defensive positions. Again, primarily then the Surovikin line in the Zaporizhzhia region, but in the media, in the NATO media, all the narratives which was being pumped because the public had to be pumped up for victory. We're going to defeat Russia, blah blah, and so this was sold as a defeat, as a victory, because everyone said, "Well, look at the map. Look at the map. The Russians are fleeing, and that means we're winning. So they're weak. Once they see the Leopard tank, they will just all run for the hills." This was the general idea. So they just sent all this well armed Ukrainian brigades, all with the newest tanks, all of this, just heading towards these defensive lines, and they were just being slaughtered. I mean, it was grotesque to watch it. And I remember I was saying then, "Oh, this is like the worst thing they can do. What are they doing?" And it's like, oh, well, if you criticize it, that means you're only attempting to reduce public support. So the public support has to be there all the time, which ends up in these stupid narratives, which are so self-destructive. I mean, this 2023, you even had Ukrainian generals appearing in the Washington Post saying, "Well, we didn't want to do this. We knew this was going to be a disaster, but the Americans were telling us that well, you have to do it." So again, that's where the decisions were being made. I did want to ask you though about because you spend a lot of time there near the front, and how do you assess the morale among the Russian troops? Because a key assumption as well was that while the Ukrainians were fighting for the homeland, the Russians morale would begin to drop once the war went on, because the Russians were the aggressors. This is just a war for territory, for the leadership. So they wouldn't, the morality would plummet, and the whole assumption that the Russians would accept that this was an existential threat was just dismissed as cheap propaganda. So. But I think they neglected us as well as how the Russians were feeling there. So I'm not sure how much you'd spoken to the Russian soldiers, how they see this fight and the morale among them.
Okay. So best way to describe this. On the one side, when this all started, so this was it was a lot of people are a bit confused from society, because it probably wasn't the best sold campaign to begin with, and the reasons. Now, people like myself who were a lot closer to what was going on in the Donbass understood what's going on. The Donbass are the most nationalistic Russians that you will ever find, because they have paid for their Russianness with their blood and the blood of their children. And that has spread, is spreading and has spread in Russia amongst a lot of the population. The existential crisis people understood, but that didn't hit us close to home, because when you said the West was looking at Ukrainians are fighting in defense of their own land, and the Russians are invaders, for Russians this is Russian homeland. This is Russian historical lands. Kiev was the third capital of Russia. Starting with Old Ladoga, then Rurik from Old Ladoga built Novgorod, And then his sword brother, who had adopted Rurik's son, Igor, moved down. Oleg came down and captured Kiev, which is part of the Khazar Empire, was the westernmost vassal of the Khazar Empire. And this is all Russian historical lands and has been for well over 1,000 years. So, and these eastern provinces are absolutely Russian lands. There's absolutely nothing that can be in doubt over what Nova Russia is. So for Russians, this has become not just an existential crisis. This has become a fight for the homeland. This is Russian land. This is for Holy Rus. Because don't forget, there's a lot of Kazakh units and a lot of Orthodox Christian units, volunteer units that formed up and are still recruiting and forming. That they go in with the badge of Christ, Christ's head on a flag, the face of Christ, or angels, or what have you. I mean, I've got a patch like that myself, and they go in there, and it's for Holy Rus. We're fighting for orthodoxy, and the more on the other side, the destruction of the canonical church, the destruction of churches in general, when the Ukrainian drones are targeting old Orthodox churches inside of Russia and in eastern Ukraine for destruction, and so on and so on. For the Russian Orthodox Christians, for the more religious Christians, this is a holy war. This is a holy war against evil, against Satanism. And a lot of the Muslims in Russia have joined up for this as a holy war against Satanism. That's what, in the Chechens, if you listen to the Chechens, now, first of all, Ahmad Sila is about 50% Russian, 20% Chechen, and the other 30% is everybody else. But they, Apti and others have said the same thing. This is a holy war. The Russians are leading the holy war, and there's an old saying: the Chechens back God, the Chechens back the Russians because the Russians are backed by God. And this is quite literally, I mean, to Western Europeans, this is going to be a head explosion for the modern Western European that's anti-Christian, anti-religion, anti-everything. But for us, this is morphing into more, on the one hand, Vladimir Vladimirovich, they're all trying to put a bit of a brake on this, but this is how it's growing very quickly inside a very large chunk of the Russian population. I won't say all the Russian population, and will never be all the Russian population, but all of what has happened in the Russian mentality, which is already starting to form, but has accelerated, is, wait a minute, we're not Europeans. We're our own civilization. We've always been that. And the Russian pendulum swings either way. Either everybody becomes a Westophile, and it doesn't matter, if a Westerner brings a piece of his personal crap from the toilet up to you, and they go, "Oh, it's golden because it's from the West. It's even the crap is holy." To swing the pendulum to the exact opposite. And if somebody's bringing you a cure from the West, it's satanic and it's evil. And the pendulum will swing throughout Russian history that way. And the pendulum is swinging very, very fast in the other direction. Where Russians are remembering again that, hey, you know what? We're our own civilization. We've always been. We may be part of Europe, but we're not part of the Western civilization, and we don't want to be. And that's the key point. You hear Western companies going, "Oh yeah, when this is over, we'll just go back to Russia." A lot of you won't, because the people don't want them there, or they left. Fine. Chevron, Exxon try to come back, and I've been told by people who were in some of those negotiations that they got told by the government, "We really don't want these guys back. We don't need them, and we don't want them. That age is gone. That's over." And that's all part of this formation. The war changes societies. It does. It takes on a life of its own. It takes on a culture of its own, and it can radicalize changes that may have taken 20, 30, 40 years, and they'll happen in 3 or 4 years. Or the changes that may have never gone that far without going much further. And those European leaders that think when this is over, it's going to be business as usual, it's not. And Russia's felt it's felt its strength. It's withstood the super sanction. The fear of sanctions it was in Russia was huge. Don't get me wrong. 22, 21, the threats before, there was an actual palatable fear among a lot of people of sanctions and what this is going to do and how this is going to happen. And when, there's one thing when you threaten somebody or you promise them punishment, but you don't haven't done it, and in their mind they're creating much worse scenarios. Oh my God, it's like a child. Oh my God, I'm going to get spanked. Oh, this is going to be horrible. It's going to break my legs. Oh, I'm going to be destroyed. Oh, I got spanked. That's it? Really? Okay, so I'll stand in the corner for 20 minutes after that. I got to do whatever I want to do before that. Spanking isn't that bad. And this is the same thing that happened with all these threats from the West. They hit and they go, and this ain't bad. We can survive this. Oh, wait a minute. We've got strength we didn't realize we had. And 20th sanction package. Yeah, at this point, people laugh. Oh, what's the next thing? Come on, bring it on. The quite literal society doesn't give a damn. Russian society does not give a damn about Western side. Bring 50 more packages. We just don't give a damn. This is at the level it's gotten to. There's no fear of sanctions. And most people, some of the guys I even thought might leave Russia haven't left. And their mentality is, if they declare war, yeah, I'll go fight. I might not volunteer. I'm not going to volunteer before that, but maybe some have. But if I've got to go fight, I'll go fight. If it becomes a declaration of war, sure, I'm not leaving. And it's seriously changed mentality of society. So it's gone past existential political crisis for the state to we're fighting for Holy Rus. This is part of the even the provinces, the way they're being referred to is now the new old provinces, because they used to be part of Russia and they're newly again part of Russia. So it's the new old provinces. And if you haven't noticed the rhetoric when portions of Kharkov or Sumy or Dnipropetrovsk Oblast are taken, they're not taken, they're not occupied, they are liberated. And liberation means a certain thing there. So the chances that they're going to get negotiated away grows smaller and smaller every day this conflict continues. So it's a serious mentality change.
It's